The room was heavy with silence, the kind that comes before thunder breaks the sky. All eyes turned as Justice Samuel Alito leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into that smirk so many had seen before. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he let out a laugh that wasn't just a laugh, it was a scoff, a dagger meant to belittle. "Congresswoman," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "perhaps your law degree doesn't quite prepare you for the complexity of this issue." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Some muffled their shock, others glanced around nervously, but everyone felt the sting. In that instant, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett being mocked. It was every young lawyer who had clawed their way through night classes, every first-generation student who had fought for a seat at the table, every immigrant's child who had been told they weren't enough. Alito's words carried the weight of centuries of arrogance, the presumption that power alone makes one's voice valid. And yet Crockett did not flinch. She did not fold under the pressure of the highest bench in the land. Instead, she sat in perfect stillness, her eyes fixed on Alito, her expression calm, unreadable, as if she'd seen this performance before, as if she had been preparing for this very moment all her life. The silence stretched, and for a heartbeat, it was Alito who looked uneasy, as if the echo of his own contempt was louder than he intended. Then the narration slows, freezes the frame. In that instant, the entire chamber froze. But what came next wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a revelation. The smirk on Alito's face lingered like smoke in the air, but the tide had already shifted. People in the gallery leaned forward, sensing a collision about to unfold. This wasn't going to be another exchange lost in the noise of politics. This was the beginning of a reckoning. Because Crockett wasn't just armed with words. She was armed with something far more dangerous to arrogance. Facts, records, proof. The kind of evidence that strips away pretension and leaves only truth standing. And as her hand reached slowly toward the stack of papers beside her, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Because when the documents hit the table, the nation gasped. To the casual observer, Alito's scoff might have seemed like just another sharp jab in a political joust, one more dismissive remark in a chamber built on them. But to those who felt the sting, who understood the weight of such words, it was more than a passing insult. It was the embodiment of a larger battle, one older than the Constitution itself, the arrogance of hierarchy against the truth of lived experience. Every smirk from a bench like his, every sneer delivered under the cover of formality, carried with it centuries of exclusion. The idea that only a certain pedigree, a certain class, a certain kind of American could dare to speak with authority. That anyone outside those walls should sit quietly and be grateful just to be allowed in. And yet here was Jasmine Crockett, unapologetic, unshaken, unmoved by the performance of power. She wasn't supposed to rise in these spaces. She wasn't supposed to speak with confidence that matched the robes of the justices. The system was designed to remind her, again and again, that she was an outsider, a voice meant to be tolerated at best, silenced at worst. But Crockett wasn't built to shrink. She carried the weight of communities too long unheard. She represented those who worked double shifts just to send their children to schools where the odds were stacked against them. She represented those who had seen the doors of opportunity slammed shut and decided to build new doors anyway. Every degree, every credential, every fight she had survived to sit in that room was proof that hierarchy was not destiny. That's why this clash mattered. It wasn't about one dismissive remark. It was about the audacity of someone in power mocking the very pathway that millions had walked, the struggle for education, for recognition, for respect. When Alito scoffed at her law degree, he scoffed at theirs too. And that's what made this moment electric. Because when someone embodies both dignity and defiance, when they turn insult into fuel, the stage is set for something unforgettable. The room didn't know it yet, but it was standing on the edge of history. Viewers watching from their phones and laptops wouldn't just see a sparring match. They would see a mirror of their own struggles, a validation of their own voices. They would feel the sting of the insult and the thrill of the comeback as if it were happening to them. And for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, the immigrant child translating paperwork for their parents, the first-generation college student fighting off doubt, the worker mocked for their accent or their clothes. This moment became a stand-in for their own. Crockett wasn't just responding for herself. She was responding for them. That's why you couldn't look away. This wasn't just politics as usual. It was the collision of arrogance and authenticity, hierarchy and humanity, SMIRK and steel. You're about to witness a takedown that no one saw coming. But to understand why this moment was so explosive, we need to look closer at the man behind the SMIRK. To understand why this single scoff struck so deeply, you have to understand the man who delivered it. Judge Samuel Alito is not simply another figure on the bench. He is a symbol of a judicial philosophy wrapped in hauteur, a man whose reputation has been shaped as much by his rulings as by his posture of superiority. For decades, Alito has carried himself with the confidence of someone who believes his judgment sits beyond reproach, someone who sees challenges not as tests of principle, but as irritations to be swatted away. From his early years in the judiciary, observers noticed a pattern. Alito rarely engaged opponents as equals. He dismissed their arguments, often with a tone that suggested not only disagreement but disdain. His questions from the bench weren't merely sharp. They were pointed reminders of hierarchy, designed to reassert his place at the top of the legal mountain. To many, he wasn't just interpreting the law. He was wielding it like a weapon, a gavel turned into a hammer. This persona was reinforced in his written opinions, which frequently dripped with a certainty that brooked no humility. Critics argued that his reasoning, while technically precise, was delivered with a coldness that revealed more about his worldview than about constitutional clarity. Where others saw complexity, Alito often saw foolishness. Where others saw good faith disagreement, he saw incompetence. Take his responses to dissenters on the court. Rather than acknowledging the legitimacy of opposing perspectives, Alito frequently skewered them with rhetorical flourishes meant less to illuminate than to diminish. It wasn't just that he disagreed, it was that he wanted you to feel small for ever daring to question him. For the ambitious clerk, the hopeful attorney, the nervous advocate standing before him, that attitude was unmistakable. He made sure of it. And yet this wasn't arrogance born overnight. It was cultivated through decades of power, reinforced by institutions that rewarded his rigidity. He was elevated, celebrated, and handed authority without ever being forced to face the kind of skepticism that ordinary Americans know all too well. Each new appointment, each validation of his worldview, stacked higher the pedestal on which he perched. From there, the view is intoxicating and blinding. Alito's critics often note how his demeanor reflects a broader philosophy of exclusion. He doesn't simply guard the gates of power. He makes clear who he believes belongs inside them. That smirk, that scoff at Crockett's law degree, was no accident. It was muscle memory. It was the reflex of a man who had spent his career equating prestige with legitimacy and dismissing anything outside his narrow definition of worth. There are countless examples. In oral arguments, he has brushed aside lawyers who stumble over their words, not with patience but with a sharpness designed to remind them that their nervous humanity had no place before him. In interviews and speeches, he has signaled contempt for social movements that dared to challenge the court's authority. His dissenting opinions often strike not just at ideas, but at the credibility of those who hold them. Always the same pattern. Establish dominance, reinforce hierarchy, keep challengers in their place. To some, this posture comes across as intellectual strength. To others, it reads as pure arrogance, arrogance that corrodes the very ideals of justice he claims to defend. Because justice is supposed to be blind, not belittling. It is supposed to weigh arguments on their merit, not on whether the speaker carries the right pedigree or tone. And yet, in Alito's courtroom, arrogance often masquerades as certainty. This is what made his encounter with Jasmine Crockett so electric. He assumed he was once again dealing with an opponent who would shrink beneath his disdain. He believed his scoff would do what it had always done: silence the challenger, reaffirm his dominance, and signal to the room that the conversation was over. But what he failed to see was that his own arrogance had set the stage for something he couldn't control. Because arrogance has a fatal flaw. It blinds the arrogant to the strength of those they dismiss. It dulls their awareness of shifting tides. It convinces them that a smirk is stronger than evidence, that hierarchy can outlast truth. And so, as Alito leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his performance, he never noticed the papers stacked neatly in front of Crockett. He never saw the quiet fire in her composure. He never realized that the very weapon he wielded for decades was about to turn against him. And yet, arrogance has one fatal flaw. It blinds you to the evidence staring you in the face. Before the chamber knew her as the Congresswoman who could stare down a Supreme Court justice, Jasmine Crockett was something else entirely. A fighter forged in the shadows of doubt. A woman whose rise to Congress was not paved by privilege, but carved through persistence. Her story was never meant to fit neatly inside the marble halls of power, and that's precisely why it resonates far beyond them. Long before cameras captured her calm defiance, Crockett was the young woman poring over case law in the dead of night, fueled not by entitlement but by hunger. Hunger to prove wrong those who whispered she wasn't cut out for the grind. Hunger to lift her family out of the margins. Hunger to represent voices history had overlooked. While classmates leaned on networks of generational connections, she leaned on grit. Every degree she earned was not handed down like inheritance. It was clawed from hours of study that left her eyes burning and her spirit aching. She knew the sting of being underestimated. She knew the weight of walking into classrooms where professors looked at her not as a prodigy but as a question mark. And she knew the silence of being one of the few, sometimes the only black women in spaces built for others. But Crockett learned early that silence can be deceptive, because while others doubted, she absorbed. While others mocked, she memorized. Each chuckle at her expense was converted into fuel. Her journey through law school was not a montage of champagne toasts and easy victories. It was the late nights spent hunched over borrowed books. It was the balancing act of taking on jobs to keep tuition paid while still keeping grades sharp. It was the quiet prayers whispered over pages of constitutional law, the whispered promises to herself that she would not quit, no matter how many doors slammed shut. And then came the courtroom, the first time she stood before a judge, heart pounding but voice steady. Every word was a declaration that she belonged. Every argument was more than legal reasoning. It was proof that her presence was earned. She didn't just fight for clients. She fought for the dignity of everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough to be heard. When she stepped into politics, the battles only grew louder. Critics scoffed that she was too raw, too unpolished, too much. But Crockett never aimed to be palatable to the powerful. She aimed to be undeniable for the people who sent her there. Her campaigns weren't fueled by elite donors or insider endorsements. They were powered by neighbors, activists, working families who saw in her their own grit reflected back. Every vote she won carried the weight of trust from communities long sidelined. By the time she walked into that chamber to face Alito, Crockett was not just a congresswoman. She was the sum of countless late nights, countless humiliations turned into hard-earned victories. She carried the scars of being underestimated, and those scars had become her armor. Where others saw arrogance in Alito's smirk, she saw something familiar, the same dismissive sneer she had endured for years. And she knew exactly what to do with it. But Crockett's strength wasn't just in her personal journey. It was in what she represented. For every student working 2 jobs just to keep up with tuition. For every immigrant family who sacrificed so their children could step into classrooms they never dreamed of entering themselves. For every community told they were too loud, too unrefined, too unqualified to speak truth to power. Crockett wasn't sitting in that chamber for herself alone. She was sitting for millions. That's why the smirk didn't rattle her. That's why the scoff didn't sting the way Alito intended. To Crockett, it was simply the latest verse in a song she had been hearing her entire life, the sneer of exclusion, the laugh of condescension. She had heard it before, and she had beaten it before. What set her apart was not only her readiness to respond, but her refusal to let arrogance define her limits. Crockett's journey taught her something Alito had never learned. True power does not come from dismissing others, it comes from refusing to be dismissed. True legitimacy is not inherited, it is earned in the trenches of struggle, and every fiber of her being had been preparing for this very collision. In that chamber, she was not simply defending her credentials. She was defending every young lawyer who felt invisible, every student who stayed up late believing knowledge could be their ticket to change, every dreamer who was told their identity made them less. That is why the chamber's silence felt so charged. Everyone sensed something was about to happen, though few could name it. Alito thought he had delivered a final word, but he had in fact triggered the beginning of his unraveling. Which is exactly why when Alito laughed she didn't flinch. She was waiting for this. The chamber still buzzed with the echo of Alito's scoff. His voice carried the weight of centuries of gatekeeping, as if mocking her degree were enough to end the exchange. He leaned forward now, eyes narrowing, his tone sharpened to the kind of precision only arrogance mistakes for brilliance. "Congresswoman," he said, pausing just long enough for the pause itself to feel like a taunt, "these are matters that require, let's say, a more sophisticated grasp than what your resume suggests." The words slithered into the air, deliberate, practiced. To him, it was the finishing blow. But Crockett didn't blink. She didn't scramble for words, didn't protest or defend her credentials. Instead, she sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes steady. The silence that followed became louder than any argument. Every second she refused to break unnerved him. What was meant to humiliate her only amplified his discomfort. For the first time, his smirk faltered. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Camera shutters clicked. Observers in the gallery exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, mouths half open in disbelief. A low murmur rustled across the room, half shock, half anticipation. Even among those accustomed to the theater of politics, this felt different. This was not the usual back and forth of partisanship. This was something sharper, heavier, the kind of tension that presses on your chest. Alito cleared his throat and pressed on, his words growing clipped. "It's admirable, I suppose, that you found your way here, but the law, real law, is not a matter of sentiment or slogans. It's about structure, discipline, and intellectual rigor that—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing his own voice was rising. He was arguing harder than he meant to, sounding less like a judge and more like a man trying to regain control of a conversation slipping from his grip. And still, Crockett remained composed, letting the silence stretch. Her calmness was not passive. It was surgical. Each moment she didn't respond reminded the chamber of the imbalance, the justice blustering, the Congresswoman poised. What he thought would expose her inexperience was instead exposing his own fragility. The cameras caught it all. Alito's fingers drumming nervously against the desk, the way his eyes darted away and back again, the stiffness in his posture. The air itself seemed to tighten. Reporters scribbled faster, sensing they were documenting a turning point. Even the most seasoned observers felt the charge, as if history was cracking open in real time. Finally, Crockett leaned forward, not with haste but with precision. Her voice, when it came, was even and deliberate. "With all due respect, Justice Alito," she said, "I didn't come here to trade credentials. I came here to discuss facts." Gasps. A ripple rolled across the chamber. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to remind everyone present that this wasn't simply an exchange of words. It was a clash of values. Arrogance against dignity. Dismissiveness against unshakable calm. For Alito, the moment was disorienting. He had banked on her breaking, or at least stumbling, under the weight of his dismissal. Instead, she had inverted the balance. His effort to frame her as unqualified had left him looking petty, defensive, and increasingly small. Crockett allowed the silence to stretch again. Then, with the faintest trace of steel in her tone, added, And facts, unlike opinions, tend not to crumble under scrutiny. That was when the whispers turned into audible reactions, gasps, muffled laughter, murmurs of astonishment. Phones in the gallery glowed as spectators typed frantically, eager to share what they were witnessing. Alito shifted uncomfortably, caught between indignation and unease. The tension in the room was unbearable now, like the final note of a symphony that refused to resolve. Everyone knew something was coming, though no one knew what form it would take. Crockett's composure had drawn the audience to the edge of their seats, and Alito's unraveling had only primed them for what came next. And then, with a single stack of papers, the entire room tilted. The moment began not with a shout but with the faintest scrape of paper sliding against wood. Crockett's hand rested on the stack beside her, a collection of neatly clipped documents, their edges squared, their weight undeniable. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The room was already hers. Every eye followed as her fingers lifted the first sheet. "Since there's some confusion," she began, her voice calm, steady, almost conversational, "let's clear it up with the record." The chamber stilled. Even Alito's pen, which had been nervously tapping, froze midair. Crockett raised the page high enough for the cameras to catch, then lowered her gaze to read. Case file, United States v. Brown. Justice Alito's opinion, dated June 2011. Here, he affirms the very principle he just suggested was beyond my grasp. His words, not mine. The statutory framework, while complex, rests on the basic constitutional understanding accessible to all practitioners of law. Pause. The words echoed. A few in the gallery gasped, others tilted their heads, startled by the clarity of the contradiction. Crockett let the silence breathe, watching the realization wash over the room before gently placing the page back onto the stack. "And that," she continued softly, "is just the beginning." She lifted another sheet, her movements deliberate, choreographed like a conductor raising a baton. Case file, Garcia v. Texas. Justice Alito's concurrence, 2009. He argued for deference to state courts, but here, he acknowledged that procedural arguments must never override a fair hearing of constitutional claims. Her eyes flicked up. "Justice, you wrote those words, so I'm struggling to see how you reconcile them with your remarks today." This time the murmur was louder. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed tight on Alito's face. His smirk, once so confident, had flattened into a thin line. His jaw twitched as though caught between indignation and alarm. He leaned forward, but no words came. Crockett pressed on. "Here's the thing about the law, Justice. It remembers. Every page, every precedent, every ruling, it leaves a trail. And when you scoff at a degree, you're not mocking me. You're mocking the very framework you've built your career upon." Another pause, this one deliberate, sharp, the kind that leaves an audience hanging on the next word. And then the room erupted, not in noise but in energy. Phones were raised higher, spectators texted furiously. On Twitter, hashtags began to trend. Receipts, Crockett vs. Alito, law degree justice. Screens lit up with clips already clipped and shared, the world outside reacting in real time. A commentator in the press pool whispered audibly into her recorder, "This isn't just a rebuttal, it's a dismantling." Crockett lifted yet another page, her calm composure now radiating control. Case file, Mitchell v. Wisconsin. Justice Alito's majority opinion, 2019. You emphasize the necessity of clear, consistent application of constitutional standards, especially where individual rights are at stake. Her voice sharpened. "Individual rights, Justice. Does that ring a bell?" A ripple of laughter broke out in the gallery. The sound was low, nervous, but unmistakable. Alito shifted in his seat, the first bead of sweat forming at his temple. He tried to interrupt, lips parting as if to object, but Crockett's timing was perfect. She spoke right through him, her tone still measured, her pace unbroken. "Because here's the truth. The law is not a weapon reserved for the privileged few. It's a shield for every citizen. That was the promise written in your own opinions, until suddenly, when challenged by someone you didn't expect, you forgot your own words. Alito's face hardened, but the power in the room had already shifted. His authority, once assumed, was being dismantled line by line, citation by citation. And each time Crockett placed another document back onto the stack, it was like a gavel slamming down, punctuating the end of arrogance. The cinematic rhythm built: lift, read, pause, reveal, reaction. Lift, read, pause, reveal, reaction. By the fifth document, the spectators were leaning forward, practically on the edge of their seats. By the sixth, even those loyal to Alito's worldview could no longer deny the precision of the attack. By the seventh, the gallery wasn't just watching, it was living the moment. Phones buzzed with notifications. Clips went viral mid-scene. Crockett's voice, steady and unflinching, contrasted with Alito's paling face. Twitter exploded with commentary. One viral post read, "She's quoting his own words back at him. This is history." Another, "Years of arrogance undone in minutes." Still, Crockett never raised her voice. Her calm was her weapon. Her composure was the blade that cut deeper than any shout could. And every moment Alito twitched, shifted, or tried to interject, he looked smaller, not just in stature but in presence. Finally, after stacking document upon document, Crockett rested her hands lightly on the table, her voice lowering into something almost intimate, as if she were speaking not just to Alito but to the nation watching. "You see, Justice, the difference between us is not knowledge, it's not intellect, it's not even power. The difference is this: when I earned my degree, I earned it knowing I would have to defend it every single day. You've sat in your seat believing no one would ever dare to question yours, but here we are. And today, the record speaks louder than your smirk." The words landed like thunder, reverberating through the chamber. The silence that followed was deafening, not empty, but electric, the kind of silence that comes when the truth finally pierces through the performance. Alito shifted again, but whatever words he might have had were gone. The smirk had vanished completely. His eyes darted toward the papers, then toward the gallery, as if searching for some anchor in a room that had turned against him. Crockett leaned back, letting the weight of her words settle. She didn't need to push further. The documents, his own words, his own contradictions, had already delivered the blow. The dismantling was complete, and the chamber knew it. Spectators began to buzz again, louder this time, their whispers merging into a chorus of awe. Reporters whispered into cameras, commentators texted headlines in real time, Twitter feeds overflowed with commentary. The moment was no longer confined to the chamber. It was spilling into living rooms, phones, and hearts across the country. And yet, as powerful as it felt in that room, the true impact was still to come. Because this wasn't just a courtroom takedown, it was a cultural earthquake. But the true shockwaves weren't in that room. They were waiting outside, across America. It started like a spark on dry brush, one clip, one caption, one share. And within minutes the fire was everywhere. The hashtags shot up the charts, climbing faster than even seasoned analysts expected. Crockett receipts, Alito owned, law degree power, each one pulsed across timelines like drumbeats of vindication. On Instagram, reels of Crockett's calm dismantling looped endlessly. On TikTok, creators stitched their reactions, mouths dropping open, hands clapping, eyes widening as they mouthed, "She did not just do that." Memes flew like confetti. Alito's stunned face froze in mid-blink, his smirk evaporated, became the centerpiece. Someone captioned it, "When you forget what you wrote in 2011. Another, "Justice served with receipts." Students layered his expression over Beyonce, "Don't play with me" audio. Even professional law blogs couldn't resist sharing side-by-side comparisons. Alito's words then, Crockett's counter now. The contrast was undeniable, and the internet reveled in it. But the reaction wasn't just digital noise. Something deeper cut through. Lawyers who rarely spoke outside their ivory towers tweeted, almost begrudgingly, about Crockett's surgical precision. One noted, I've spent 20 years practicing appellate law. What she did in that room was as masterful as any Supreme Court argument I've ever heard. Law students chimed in, posting screenshots of her lines next to their textbooks, calling her the professor we wish we had. Even critics who had once dismissed Crockett as performative found themselves pausing. A conservative columnist admitted on live television, "Look, I don't agree with her politics, but what we witnessed was a textbook takedown." And frankly, Alito walked right into it. The commentary created an unexpected chorus: admiration from allies, acknowledgement from skeptics, and silence, telling, heavy silence from those who had once defended Alito without hesitation. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans watched from their living rooms, their phones, their buses, and break rooms. A grandmother in Detroit messaged her church group, "She stood up for us and they couldn't laugh her down." A first-generation law student in Houston posted, "I've been told my accent makes me sound less credible. Today, I feel like I belong." A factory worker in Ohio tweeted, "For once, someone spoke in that chamber like they were speaking for people like me." The validation rippled outward, touching people who had felt dismissed, talked over, minimized. Crockett's calm didn't just expose Alito, it vindicated every person who had ever been sneered at for daring to step into rooms built to exclude them. Her words weren't just hers anymore. They belonged to everyone watching. Cable news plastered the moment on repeat. Primetime anchors framed it as a turning point. Not since Anita Hill has a single voice so thoroughly shaken the image of judicial untouchability. Commentators argued over the implications, but one truth cut through. Crockett had cracked the facade of elitism live, and no one could unsee it. And as the noise crescendoed, the emotion crystallized. America wasn't just entertained, it was moved. People weren't just laughing at the memes or retweeting the burns. They were feeling something stir. That old sense of possibility. That rare moment when dignity doesn't just survive arrogance, it outshines it. Because what happened in that chamber wasn't just a debate. It was a revelation. Proof that hierarchy can falter. Proof that representation matters. Proof that lived experience, armed with truth, can topple even the loftiest SMIRK. But beyond the noise, a deeper truth emerged, one that America couldn't ignore. In the quiet after the storm, when the hashtag slowed and the headlines began to fade, something more enduring lingered. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had silenced a scoff. It was that her calm had spoken louder than arrogance ever could. In that chamber, the clash between elitism and earned wisdom had played out in real time, and wisdom had won. Judge Alito had the robes, the bench, the centuries of tradition behind him. He leaned on status, on the authority of hierarchy. But status alone cannot withstand truth. Crockett brought none of his privilege, and yet all of her preparation, her grit, and her lived reality became a weapon far sharper than condescension. She proved that knowledge, when earned through struggle and dedication, outlasts the brittle veneer of entitlement. This wasn't just about law degrees or legal arguments. It was about something universal, the fight between suppression and truth. For generations, the powerful have tried to silence voices by laughing at them, by dismissing them, by reducing them to caricatures of unqualified or unworthy. That laugh, that scoff, it was never just about Crockett. It was about every person told they don't belong. Every worker told their accent makes them sound ignorant. Every student told their school isn't prestigious enough. Every immigrant told their story doesn't matter. And yet Crockett stood in that chamber and turned the very tools meant to belittle her into proof of her strength. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't trade insult for insult. Instead, she let the truth do the work. That is the essence of dignity, the refusal to descend to arrogance, the unshakable confidence that reality will speak for itself. Her takedown symbolized something far larger than one debate. It was justice rendered not by gavel or robe, but by knowledge, earned, lived, undeniable. It reminded America of something it too often forgets. Greatness doesn't come from titles or bloodlines or SMIRKs. It comes from persistence, from preparation, from the courage to stand when others expect you to shrink. The lesson is clear. Arrogance is loud but fleeting. Dignity is quiet but eternal. Arrogance leans on the assumption that others will be too afraid to challenge it. Dignity doesn't need to assume anything, it simply stands, and by standing, it exposes arrogance for what it is: fragile, hollow, insecure. That's why this moment matters. Not just for Crockett, not just for that chamber, but for all of us. Because every time someone like her refuses to flinch in the face of mockery, the walls built to keep ordinary people out grow weaker. Every time knowledge trumps status, the promise of America grows stronger. And so the moral carries beyond politics, beyond courtrooms. It reaches into classrooms, boardrooms, union halls, and kitchens. It whispers to the tired student, the overlooked worker, the parent who feels invisible. It says, "Your worth is not defined by who tries to diminish you. Your worth is defined by the truth you carry and the courage to stand on it." Because in America, your worth isn't measured by who mocks you, but by the truth you stand on. And that's the lesson Alito never expected to teach, the one Crockett delivered with every receipt, every pause, every calm word. The world saw arrogance stumble. The world saw dignity rise. But if that was the lesson inside the chamber, the question that followed was even bigger. What would America do with it? Judge Alito scoffed. He leaned back with that smirk, certain that a lifetime of titles and robes would insulate him from challenge. But Jasmine Crockett proved everything. With nothing more than preparation, composure, and a stack of documents, she dismantled not just an argument, but an entire posture of elitism. The story of this clash will be replayed in memes and headlines, but its moral is timeless. Arrogance fades, documents endure. Smirks vanish, but truth remains. What Crockett showed that day wasn't simply a rebuttal. It was a reminder that dignity will always carry more weight than mockery. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't just her victory. It belongs to anyone who has ever been laughed at, underestimated, or dismissed. It belongs to the students studying late at night, the workers fighting to be heard, the families carving out a place in a country that sometimes forgets who built it. Crockett carried them all in that chamber, and when the papers hit the table, so did they. Now the question turns to us. What do we do with this moment? Do we let it pass like another headline, or do we carry its lesson forward? Because every share, every conversation, every voice that amplifies this story ensures that the next time arrogance sneers, truth has the louder voice. So if you believe dignity beats arrogance, hit subscribe. If you believe truth should outshine status, share this video. Add your voice to the chorus that refuses to be silenced. Because moments like this remind us of something powerful. Arrogance may laugh, but it never lasts. Dignity, steady, unshaken, undeniable, always wins in the end.